All right, so about 4 years ago, I started reading this book, and one of my followers really wanted me to do this so she could have an easier time sleeping. So we're gonna try and continue that tonight, and hopefully she'll have a chance to listen at some point. And in the meantime, I get to figure out where I was on that one. I'm actually gonna read a little bit before where I stopped last time, and I'll probably have to upload those to my Twitch as well. But in the meantime, if you're interested, the rest of them are on an account called The Voice of Zen on YouTube. You can find them there, and I'll probably post them on Twitch eventually too, and vice versa, so they won't be too hard to find. Thanks for your patience, and I will start at just inside the first chapter here. All right, I'll start a couple sentences before where I ended last time. He gave me what he must have considered his cryptic smile. It reminded me of a grizzly awakened in midwinter. I have my reasons. Here's what I'll do for you. You get a mutual aid sticker on your ID, which should open some doors. You get to use Greg's office, and you get to go look at the open file and police report. The open file meant I would get the case as it came to Greg, bare facts and no or little findings. I would have to retrace Greg's steps. It was bloody more than I expected. Thank you, I said. The file doesn't leave the building, he said. No copies, no quotes. You'll make a complete report to me, and only to me. I'm bound by the Guild's Disclosure of Information Act, I said. He waved it aside. It's taken care of. Since when? This Night Protector was going far out of his way to help a worthless merc. Why? People who did me favors made me nervous. On the other hand, it was bad manners to look a gift horse in the mouth, even if you're getting it from an overweight cracker in a fringe shirt. Officially, you have no status with me, he said. Screw up, and you're persona non grata. Understood? We're done, he said. Outside, the receptionist waved me over and asked for my ID. I gave it to her, and watched as she affixed a small metallic mutual aid sticker to it, an official stamp of the order's interest in my humble work. Some doors would open to me, and some would slam in my face. Oh well. Don't mind Ted, the receptionist said, returning my ID. He's harsh sometimes. My name's Maxine. My name's Kate. Would you point out the late night diviner's office to me? I'd be glad to. The last one on the right. Thank you. She smiled and went back to her work. Peachy keen. I reached Greg's office and stood in the doorway. Didn't look right. A square window spilled daylight onto the floor, a narrow desk, and two old chairs. To the left, a deep bookshelf ran the length of the wall, threatening to collapse under the weight of meticulously arranged volumes. Four metal file cabinets, as tall as me, towered at the opposite wall. Stacks of files and papers, crowded in the corners, occupied the chairs and choked the desk. Someone had gone through Greg's papers. They'd done it carefully. The place wasn't ransacked, but someone had looked at each of Greg's files and didn't return them to their proper place, instead of choosing to stack them on the first horizontal surface available. These were Greg's private papers. For some reason, the idea of someone touching Greg's things, going over them, reading his thoughts after his death, really bothered me. I stepped through the doorway and felt a protective spell close behind me. Arcane symbols ignited with a pale orange glow, forming complex patterns on the gray carpet. Long twisted lines connected the symbols, crisscrossing the winding. And I totally lost my place because I looked down. That was slick. Okay, hold on a sec. All right. I stepped through the doorway and felt a protective spell close behind me. Arcane symbols ignited with a pale orange glow, forming complex patterns on the gray carpet. Long, twisted lines connected the symbols, crisscrossing and winding about the room, their intersections marked by radiant red dots. Greg had sealed the room with his own blood, and more, he'd keyed it to me. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to see the spell. Now, Any magic I did in this room would stay in it, leaving no echo behind the door. A spell of this complexity would take weeks to set up. Judging by the intensity of the glowing lines, it would absorb one hell of an echo. Why would he do that? I walked between the files to the bookshelf. It held an old edition of the Almanac of Mystic Creatures, an even older version of the Arcane Dictionary, a Bible, a beautiful edition of the Quran, found in leather and engraved with gold, several other religious volumes, and a thin copy of Spenser's Fairy Queen. I made my way to the metal cabinets. As expected, they were empty. The shelves were marked in Greg's own unique code, which I couldn't read. It didn't matter, really. I picked up the closest stack and carefully slid the first file into the metal frame. 2 hours later, I finished with the papers on the floor and the chairs, and was ready to start on the stacks covering the desk when a large manila envelope stopped me. It lay on top of the central stack, so my name, written with black marker in Greg's cursive, was plainly visible. I lowered the stacks to the floor, pulled up a chair, and emptied the envelope onto the desk's surface. 2 photographs and a letter. In the first photo, 2 couples stood side by side. I recognized my father, a hulking, red-haired man, enormous shoulders spread wide, one arm around a woman who had to be my mother. Some children retain memories of their deceased parents, a shadow of a voice, a hint of a scent, an image. I recalled nothing of her, as if she'd never existed. My father kept no photographs of her. It must have been too painful for him, and I knew only what he'd told me. She was pretty, he'd said, and she had long blonde hair. I stared at the woman in the photograph. She was short and petite. Her features matched her build, well-formed, delicate, but devoid of fragility. She stood assured, with easy, natural poise, clothed in a kind of magical allure, and perfectly aware of her power. She was beautiful. Both he and Greg told me I'd resembled her, but no matter how I studied the image, I could see no resemblance. My features were bolder, my mouth was larger, and not pouting by any stretch of the imagination. I did manage to inherit her eye color, dark brown, but my eyes had an odd cut, almond-shaped, slightly elongated, and my skin was a shade darker. If I overloaded on eyeliner and mascara, I could easily pass for a gypsy. There was more to it than that. My mother's face had genuine feminine gentleness. Mine didn't, at least not when compared to hers. If we were to stand side by side in a room full of people, I wouldn't get a second glance, and if someone had stopped to chat me up, she would have stolen him with a single smile. Pretty. Yeah. Nice understatement, Dad. On the other hand, if the same people had to pick one of us to kick a bad guy in the kneecap, I'd get the vote. No problem. Next to my mother and father, Greg stood by a lovely Asian woman, Anna, his first wife. Unlike my parents, those two stood a little apart, each maintaining a barely perceptible difference, as if their individualities would strike a spark if they reached for one another. Greg's eyes were mournful. I put the photograph back down on the desk. The other photo was of me, about 9 or 10 years old, diving into a lake from the branches of a giant poplar. I didn't know he had it or even when it was taken. I read the letter, a few sparse lines on the white piece of paper, a part of Spenser's poem. One day I wrote her name upon the strand, but came the waves and washed it away. Again I wrote it with a second hand, but came the tide and made my pains his prey. Below, 4 words were written in Greg's blood: Amahe, Turban, Sanehi, Ood. The words blazed with red fire. A powerful spasm gripped me, my lungs constricted. The room blurred, and through the dense fog of the beating of my heart sounded and through the dense fog the beating of my heart sounded loud like the toll of a church bell. A tangle of forces swirled around me, catching me in a twisted mess of slippery, elastic power currents. I reached out and gripped them, and they carried me forth, far into the amalgam of light and sound. The light permeated the light permeated me and burst within my mind, sending a myriad of sparks through my skin, the blood in my veins luminesced like molten metal. My mouth opened, struggling to release a word. It wouldn't come, and I thought I would die. And then I said it, pouring my power into the weak sound. Hassad, mine. The world stopped spinning, and I found my place in it. The four words towered before me. I had to say them. I held my power and said the words, willing them, forcing them to become mine. Amahe, Tervan, Sanehi, Ud. The flow of power ebbed. I was staring at the white piece of paper. The words were gone, and a small puddle of crimson spread across the sheet. I touched it and felt the prickling of magic. My blood. My nose was bleeding. Pulling a dressing from my pocket, where I always carried some, I pressed it against my nose and leaned back. I'd burn the bandages later. The watch on my wrist said 12:17 p.m. Somehow, within those few instants, I'd lost almost an hour and a half. The four words of power: obey, kill, protect, and die. Words so primal, so dangerous, and so powerful that they commanded the raw magic itself. Nobody knew how many of them there were, where they'd come from, or why they held such enormous hold over magic. Even people who'd never used magic recognized their meaning and were subject to their power, as if the words were a part of some ancient racial memory we all carried. It wasn't enough to merely know them. One had to own them. When it came to acquiring power words, there were no second chances. You either conquered them or you died trying, which explained why so few among the magic workers could wield them. Once you'd made them yours, they belonged to you forever. They had to be wielded with great precision, and using them took a chunk of power that left the caster near exhaustion. Greg and my father both warned me that the power words could be resisted, but so far I hadn't had a chance to use them against an opponent that did. They were the last resort when all else failed. Now I had six words, four given to me by Greg and two others, mine and release. My father taught them to me long ago. I was 12 and I almost died making them mine. This time it had been too easy. Maybe the power of the blood grew with age. I wished Greg was alive so I could ask him. I glanced at the floor. The orange lines of Greg's ward had grown so dim I could barely see them. They had absorbed everything they could. The words clamored in my head, shifting and tossing, trying to find their place. Greg's last gift, more precious than anything else he could have given me. Gradually, I became aware of someone watching me. I looked up and saw a lean black man in the doorway. He'd smiled at me when I passed by his office some 3 hours earlier. Are you all right? He asked. Tripped a residual ward, I mumbled, the rag still covering my nose. Happens. I'm okay. He eyed me. You sure? Yeah. Okay, I'm an incompetent moron. Go away now. I brought you Greg's file. He made no move to enter the room. Smart. If I'd tripped a trap set up by Greg, it could hit him as well. Sorry it's so late. One of our knights had it. I walked to him and took the file from his hands. Thanks. No problem. He regarded me for a moment and then just walked away. I rummaged through Greg's desk for a mirror. Every self-respecting mage had a mirror close to hand. Too many spells required it. Greg's was a rectangle, set in a plain wooden frame. I caught my image in it and almost dropped the rag. My hair glowed. It radiated a weak burgundy luminescence, which shifted when I ran my hands through it, as if each individual strand of hair was coated with fluorescent paint. I shook my head, but the radiance didn't dim. Growling at it didn't help either, and I had not the faintest idea of how I could get rid of it. I hid in the furthest corner of the room, invisible from the door, and opened the file. If you can't make it go away, wait it out. The last time I assimilated words of power, I was exhausted. Now, I felt exhilarated, high on magic. The energy filled me, and I struggled to contain it. I wanted to jump, to run, to do something. Instead, I had to hide in a corner and concentrate on the file before me. The file contained a coroner's report, a summary of a police report, some hurried notes, and several photos of a crime scene. A wide shot showed two bodies sprawled on the asphalt, one corpse stark, pale, and nude, and the other a bloody mess of mauled, shredded tissue. I found the close-up of the mauled corpse first. The cadaver lay spread-eagled upon a blood-soaked cloth. Something had ripped into its chest, snapped the breastbone, and tore it away with unbelievable force. The chest cavity lay exposed, the wet, glistening mass of the smashed heart dark against the spongy remains of the lungs and the yellow white of the broken ribs. The left arm, wrenched clear of its socket, hung by a thin, bloodied filament. The next shot showed the close-up of the head. Sad eyes I knew so well looking up at the camera and straight at me. Oh God. I read the caption. This battered piece of human meat was all that remained of Greg. A lump rose in my throat. I struggled with it for a few agonizing seconds, but then forced it down. This was not Greg. It was only his corpse. The next photo provided me with a close look at the other body. This one appeared untouched, all except for the head, which was missing. A broken shard of the spine jutted from the neck stump, framed by limp shreds of torn tissue. No other evidence of the head ever being there remained. There was hardly any blood. There should have been pints of it. The body lay at an angle, and both carotid and jugular were cleanly severed. So where did all the blood go? Sorry, Ashley, this is probably fairly, fairly graphic for you. Also, thank you for running my channel. Hi guys, thanks for coming. Alright, I found 4 more shots of the corpse and arranged them next to each other on the floor. The smooth marble white skin of the cadaver stretched tightly over his musculature, as if the body had no fat at all, only lean muscle. Not a single hair marred the epidermis. The scrotum looked shriveled and unusually small in size. I needed a close-up of the hand, but there was not one. Somebody had dropped the ball. It did not matter too much, since all the other telltale signs were there. Even without the nails, the conclusion was plain. I was looking at a dead vampire. Vampires are dead by definition, but this one had seized its undead existence. Not even Gastek, with all of his necromantic prowess, could fix a vampire without a head. The $64,000 question was, who did this vampire belong to? Most people branded their vampires. If this one was branded, it didn't show up in any of the shots the moron photographer had taken. What could wipe out a vampire and a night diviner? The vampire, super fast and able to take out a SWAT team unaided, would prove hard prey by itself. The vampire plus Greg made for a near impossible kill, yet here they were, both dead. I leaned back thinking, the killer would have to possess great power. He would have to be faster than a vampire, strong enough to tear the head off of a body, and be able to shield himself from Greg's magic and his mace. Off the top of my head, the list of possible murderers was rather short. First, the people could have sought to kill Greg and used one of the vampires as bait. An aged vampire in the hands of an experienced and able master of the dead was a weapon like no other. If there was more than one, they could have taken out Greg and their own bloodsucker. It was expensive and improbable, since Greg was particularly effective against vampires, but it wasn't impossible. Second, the condition of Greg's ravaged corpse pointed to the shape changers. That kind of damage had to be done with claws and teeth, and by more than one set of them. Perhaps it was a loop. A deranged shape changer. The bodies of those affected with Lycos virus, or Lyc-V for short, yearned to slaughter without discrimination, while their minds sought to restrain the bloodlust. If the mind won over the body, a shape changer became a free man of the code, existing within a well-structured and highly disciplined pack. If the body conquered the mind, a shape changer became aloof, a cannibalistic murderer driven mad by hormones, hunting everything and hunted by everyone. The Lou theory was even less probable than the people theory. For one, the beheaded vamp was untouched except for its neck, and Lou's tore into everything with maniacal frenzy. Next, Greg would have killed more than one of them, and no other bodies littered the scene. Third, if the murderer was a Lou, or more likely, several of them, they would have left a ton of evidence at the scene. Everything from saliva and hair to their own blood. The medical examiner's office had genetic profiles on almost all known shape changer types, as far as I could discern. The file contained no paper showing that any shape-changer DNA had been found at the scene. Rubbing my face didn't give me any special insights into the situation. Most likely, the murders had been committed by none of the above, and for the time being, I had to leave it at that. The autopsy report confirmed the beheaded cadaver as Homo sapiens immortus, a vampire, an iconic name since the mind of a human died the moment vampirism took hold. The vampires knew no pity and no fear. They couldn't be trained. They had no ego. On a developmental level, they stood close to insects, possessing a nervous system and yet incapable of forming thoughts. An insatiable hunger for blood ruled them, and they slaughtered everything in their path in an urge to quench it. I frowned. The file contained no M-scan. All crime scenes involving death or assault were routinely scanned for magic. Technically, both the police and MSDU could demand access to this file and be granted such access by a court order. The fact that an M scan was missing meant that it showed something the order didn't want to reveal to the general public, unless the same cretin that took the photograph somehow managed to drop the scan in the trash. The only remaining page in the file listed several female names: Sandra Malo, Angelina Gomez, Jennifer Ying, Elisa Canova. None of them sounded familiar, and no explanation of the list was offered. A fresh examination of my hair revealed that it was no longer glowing. I made a quick dash to the desk and dialed the number listed in the police report. A gruff voice answered the phone. I introduced myself and asked for the lead detective. I'm looking into the murder of the Night Diviner. We've spoken to you people, the man on the other end said. Read the goddamned report. Well, you haven't spoken to me, sir. I would very much appreciate any time you could find for me. Any time at all. The phone clanged, and I was greeted by a disconnected signal. So much for interagency cooperation. The watch on my wrist showed at 12:58 p.m. I'd have time to hit the morgue. The mandatory 1-month waiting period for dead vampires was nowhere close to running out, and the MA sticker would ensure that I'd have no problem taking a look at the bloodsucker's body. I closed the file, placed it into the closest filing cabinet, and made my escape. The city morgue stood in the middle of the downtown district. Directly across from it, past the wide expanse of the unnamed square, rose the golden dome of the Capitol building. The old morgue had been leveled twice, first by a rogue master of the dead, and second by a golem. The same one that created the unnamed square when it reduced the 5 city blocks to rubble in its failed attempt to break through the Capitol's wards. Even now, 6 years later, the city council refused to rename the empty space surrounding the Capitol, reasoning that as long as it had no name, nobody could summon anything there. The new morgue was constructed on the principle of third time's a charm. A state-of-the-art facility, it looked like the bastard offspring of a prison and a fortress, with a bit of medieval castle thrown in for good measure. The locals joked that if the Capitol building came under attack again, the state legislature could just run across the square and hide in the morgue. Looking at it, I could believe it too. A severe foreboding building, the morgue loomed among the dulled-up facades of the corporation headquarters like the Grim Reaper at a tea party. Its mercantile neighbors had to be unhappy about its presence in their midst, but could do nothing about it. The morgue got more traffic than all of them, another sign of the times. I walked up the wide staircase, between granite columns, and moved through the revolving door into a wide hall. The high windows admitted plenty of light, but failed to banish the gloom completely. It pooled in the caverns and along the walls, lying in wait to clutch at the ankles of an unwary passerby. Polished tiles of gray granite covered the floor. 2 hallways radiated from the opposite wall, both flooded by blue Fey-lantern light. The tiles ended there, replaced by yellowish linoleum. The air smelled of death. It wasn't actual nauseating odor of the rotting flesh, but a different kind of stench, one of chlorine and formaldehyde and bitter medicines, reminiscing of a hospital smell, but nobody would confuse the two. In the hospital, life left its sure signs. Here, only its absence could be felt. There was an information desk between the 2 hallways. I made my way to it and introduced myself to a clerk in green scrubs. He glanced at my ID and nodded. He's in 7C. You know where it is? Yes, I've been here before. Good. You go ahead, I'll get someone to open it for you. I took the right hallway to a flight of stairs and went down, into the basement level. I passed Section B and came to a stop at its end, where the steel gate barred my progress. After 5 minutes or so, hurried steps echoed through the hallway, and a woman, wearing green scrubs and a stained apron, came rushing around the corner. She carried a thick three-ring binder in one hand and a jingling keyring in the other. A few thin wisps of blonde hair had escaped her sterile hairnet. Dark circles surrounding her eyes and the skin on her face sagged a little. Sorry, I said. Nah, don't worry about it, she said, fumbling with the keys. It didn't hurt to take a walk. She unlocked the gate and swept past me. I followed her to a reinforced steel door. She opened two locks, stepped back, and barked. It is I, Julian, who commands you, and you shall do my bidding. Open! The magic shifted subtly as the spell released the door. Julianne swung it open. Inside, on a metal table riveted to the floor, lay a nude body. Stark against the stainless steel, it was a queer shade of pale whitish pink, as if it had been bleached. A silver steel harness enclosed the cadaver's chest. A chain as thick as my arm stretched from the harness to a ring in the floor. We usually just collar them, but with this one, Julianne waved her hand. Yeah, I glanced at the stump of the neck. Not that he'll rise or anything, not without a head. Still, if anything. She nodded towards the blue circle of a panic button on the nearest wall. You armed? I unsheathed Slayer. Julianne jerked back from the shimmering blade. Whoa. Okay, well that'll work. I slid the saber back into its sheath. There was a second body brought with it, brought in with this one. Yeah, kind of hard to forget that one. Any trace of evidence? Nice try, Julianne smirked. That's classified? I see, I said. What about an M-scan? That's classified too. I sighed. Greg, with his dark eyes and perfect face, mangled and broken, locked away in some cubicle in this lonely, sterile place. I fought the urge to double over and cradle the empty space in my chest. Julianne touched my shoulder. Who was he to you? She asked. My guardian, I told her. Apparently, my efforts to appear impartial had suffered a spectacular failure. You were close? No, but we used to be. What happened? I shrugged. I grew up and he forgot to notice. Did he have any kids? No. No wife, no children, just me. Julianne glanced at the vampire's corpse with obvious disgust. You'd think the Order would have enough sensitivity to assign someone not related to this mess. I volunteered. She gave me an odd look. How about that? I hope you know what you're doing. So do I. There's no chance you'd let me glance at the M-scan. She pursed her lips, thinking. Do you hear that? I shook my head. I think someone's at the gate. I'm gonna just go check on it, and I'm putting my binder right there. Now, these are confidential reports. I don't want you looking at them. In particular, I don't want you looking at the reports from the 3rd of this month, or taking any copies out of this file. She turned and marched out of the room. I flipped through the notebook. There were 8 autopsies on the 3rd. Finding Greg's didn't prove to be a problem. The trace evidence consisted of 4 hairs. In the origin column, someone penciled in PSB feline der unidentified, possibly a feline derivative, not a feline shapeshifter. They would have pegged it as Homo sapiens with a specific Felidae genus. The long folded sheet of the M-scan came next. Obeying the shake of my hand, it unfolded to its full 3 feet, presenting a graph drawn by the delicate needles of the magic scanner. A faint colored line on the graph wavered, a sure sign of many magic influences colliding in one spot. It was inconclusive by the most lax of standards, and no court would have permitted it into evidence. The small header on the top corner identified it as a copy. Oh, goody. I squinted, trying to make sense of it. Greg's body had continued to release its magic even after his death. and the scanner recorded it as a sloping gray line, sometimes an inch wide, sometimes almost invisible. The deep, jagged purple cutting across it had to be the vampire's magic. I looked harder. There was a third line, actually a series of lines, faint and dashing at irregular intervals through the reading. The longest was about a quarter of an inch long, and the color was undeterminable. I raised the graph so the light of the ceiling shone through it. The ink stood out. Yellow. What the hell registered yellow? I tugged at the graph, tearing it along the perforated lines, and slid it into my folder. Julianne returned shortly. Nobody there. Well, I'll leave you to it. She took the binder and walked out, leaving me with a vampire's corpse. I slipped on a pair of medical gloves and approached the body. The placement of brands depended on the personality of the master of the dead. Filion marked his with a big eye of Horus smack in the middle of the forehead. Constance marked hers in the armpit. Since the forehead on this one was conveniently missing, it could have belonged to Filion. Theoretically, I set about finding the brand. The armpits were clean, so was the chest, the spine, the back, the buttocks, the inside of the thigh, and the ankles. The only place remaining was the scrotum, so spread the vampire's legs. The testicles diminished immediately after the human's death and continued to shrink during the vampire's life. There was a whole study on dating the bloodsuckers based on the size of the reproductive organs. I didn't care how old this one was, but judging by the signs, he had to be pushing 50. And he was clean, no brand. There was a scar, however, cleaving on the left side. It looked like it had been stitched together. A quick glance told me A quick glance about told me I would find no scalpel in this room. I took Slayer from its sheath. It smoked, sensing the undead. Thin tendrils of blaze curved from the blade. Don't start dripping, I murmured, and pressed the tip of the edge against the scar. The undead tissue hissed as the blade sank into the flesh. I let it cut about a quarter of an inch and withdrew the saber, leaving a neat incision. Taking the flap of the skin, I pulled on it lightly, and it came away, revealing a smooth burn scar and an inch wide and 3/4 of an inch long. In the middle of the burned scar sat a neat scorch mark, an arrow tipped with a circle instead of an arrowhead. Gastic's brand. Why wasn't I surprised? You do know there are penalties for mutilating corpses, said a male voice. I spun around, blade in my hand. A tall man, leaning against the doorway. He wore scrubs, which meant he had more right to be here than I did. Watch out there, he said. Sorry, I lowered the saber. I don't like being startled. Neither do I, except by young, attractive women. He looked to be in his mid-30s. The colored stripe on his shoulder shone bright orange. Third-level clearance. The tag clipped to his suit confirmed it. I'd gotten a bloody unit supervisor. A unit supervisor could make a person non grata in the morgue faster than I could blink. The man waited until I finished staring at his tag and held out his left hand. My name's Crest. I peeled off my left glove without putting down Slayer and shook his hand. Kate, is there a first name that goes with Crest? Yes, but I don't like it. A funny guy. Perhaps I would get away without a black eye for dicing a corpse. It's a vampire, I said. I was looking for the brand. Find it? Yes. He approached the table to examine my handiwork. I moved to stand across from him. Dr. Crest was actually on the appealing side, auburn-haired, tall, and quite muscular, judging by the forearms. A pleasant face, open and honest, with large, well-defined features and nice eyes, honey brown and warm. The full mouth was downright sensuous. Attractive fellow, not strictly handsome in a theater, not strictly handsome in a classical sense, but, still, he looked up from the body, smiled, and became handsome. I smiled back, trying to radiate integrity and decency of character. That's right, I'll be very nice to you, sir. Just please don't bar me from the morgue. Interesting, I said. I've never seen one concealed in this way. Interesting, he said, sorry. Neither have I. You see a lot of vampires in your line of work? Unfortunately. I caught him glancing at me as he lowered his gaze back to the body. Dr. Crest? He blinked. Yes? Do I need to let Julianne know about the brand? It was the least I could do. No, I can tell her myself if you have to run. A little warning bell went off in my head. The good doctor was a little too accommodating. I would have to make sure that Julianne got my message. Crest was frowning at the corpse, a devious place to put the brand. Gastek was a devious fellow. Indeed. Another pause issued. Let me walk you upstairs, he said. How charming. He was trying to make sure that I didn't go on a mutilating rampage. I gave him my knockout smile. Sure. He didn't look dazzled. Damn it, that's the second time today my smile had misfired. We left, walking side by side. I waited while he locked the gate behind us. So what do we do here, Quest? Bleh. Wow, messed that one up real good. So what do you do here, Dr. Crest? He grimaced. I suppose one can call it charity work. I made the appropriate noise. Charity? Yes. I perform reconstructive surgery. He glanced at me as if afraid I would demand a nose job. I make corpses presentable. Not everyone can afford it, so twice a week I do it here pro bono. I nodded. It's kids mostly, he said. Torn up and mauled. Not a pretty sight. Such a waste. We reached the upper floor. He waited while I checked out with the clerk and wrote down Julianne's number, and then walked me to the door. So I'll see you again sometime, he said. Hopefully not on the operating table, I said, and left the building. As I walked away to where Carmelian waited for me, I could feel Crest watching my back. A man was leaning against my truck. He wore a dark gray shirt, black jeans, tucked in soft boots, and a black cloak that wanted very much to be a cape. While I was in the morgue, the sun had broken through the clouds, flooding the streets with sunshine. He seemed to shrug off the sun's rays. Not a man, but a rectangle of darkness cut in the shroud of sunlight. The human current streaming up the street bent away from him. People didn't eye him. In fact, they concentrated so hard on ignoring his presence, one could have dropped a $20 bill on the ground, and it probably would have gone unnoticed. The man's eyes tracked my movement. I stopped a few feet away and looked at him. He reached into an inside pocket of his cloak and flicked out what looked to be a long yellow ribbon at me. I caught it in mid-flight. The smooth, cold body coiled around my wrist, and the serpentine head reared to strike my face. I clamped its neck with fingers on my left hand and stopped it 3 inches from my neck. The snake's tongue danced between its scaly lips. Blood-red membranes, tingled with vibrant purple, flared on both sides of the head, spreading like the wings of an enormous butterfly. The baby winged snake shuddered, trying to take flight, but I held it in check. I'm sorry, Jim. He held up his arms, indicating something about 3 feet wide. The cloak parted enough to show muscle roll across his chest under the fabric of his shirt. The nest was this big, Kate. His voice had the smooth, almost melodious tone of a less dangerous, much prettier man. It clashed badly with his bulldog, ugly mug. You owe me, and you stood me up. I had to do the gig single-handedly. The snake twisted in a feeble attempt to sink its fangs into my arm. The long, triangular teeth contained no poison, but the bite hurt like hell. Greg's dead, I said. There was a tiny pause before he asked, when? 2 days ago. He was murdered. You want it? Yup. He stood for a while, caught in a painful silence. He peeled himself from my truck, moving with a liquid animal grace that only a master shape changer could achieve. Well, you need anything, you know where to find me. I nodded and watched him walk up the stairs to the morgue. Jim? He scowled at me over his shoulder. Yeah. What are you doing at the morgue? Packed business, he said, and moved on. Everyone had business in the morgue these days, even Jim. I still owed him for this winter when he pulled me out of a mud pit full of melted snow and hydra. He was the closest thing to a partner I had. Once in a while, we shared merc jobs from the guild. This time, I had stood him up. I'd have to make it up to him. But first, I'd have to find out who killed Greg. To do that, I'd have to figure out what Gastek's vampire was doing at the murder scene. I eased the pressure on the snake's neck and gently tossed it into the air. The serpent plummeted and suddenly took flight. It soared higher and higher, far above the rooftops into the sunshine until it finally disappeared from sight. And I am going to end that there because my voice is now giving out. Thank you guys for joining me. I will edit that and pretty it up a little and throw it on YouTube. and hopefully we'll make this a weekly thing. So if you want to join me again next week, I'd appreciate that. Thanks for coming.